Okay, so let's start with the definition of necrosis. First of all, necrosis comes from Greek and it literally means the act of dying. Necrosis is a type of cell death that happens in case of persistent cell injury. In other words, cell necrosis happens once cell injury progresses past a threshold after which recovery is no longer possible and injury is irreversible. Necrosis happens almost always as a result of a pathological process. Okay, so let's take a look at the morphology of necrotic cells. So first of all, they tend to have increased eosinophilia. Then they tend to have masses called myelin figures showing up inside of them. They have membrane discontinuities and they have dilation of mitochondria. Now let's see why each of these things happen. Regarding increased eosinophilia, it's usually attributed to two different things. Firstly, loss of cytoplasmic RNA, which is something that usually binds to the blue dye. It's basophilic, so when we lose it, the whole thing tends to get eosinophilic. The other thing is the presence of a lot of the natured cytoplasmic proteins, which are just eosinophilic, and when we have a lot of them, it increases eosinophilia. The other thing we mentioned are myelin figures. So myelin figures are phospholipid masses derived from degenerated membranes. So they tend to degrade into fatty acids and then get calcified. I also mentioned membrane discontinuities and membrane disintegration. This one is basically a hallmark of necrosis. It happens due to several different reasons, mostly due to the reactive oxygen species. The last thing we mentioned was dilation of mitochondria. This one is usually due to the changes to its permeability. That is also usually due to reactive oxygen species and also other reasons. You can also see our swollen cell here on the right. You can see how it has got bigger in comparison to a normal cell. You can see the myelin figure as well as the swollen mitochondria, internal organelles, and you can see how the membrane is getting disintegrated. Okay, so let's take a look at the nuclear changes that happen during necrosis. The nuclear changes can happen via three different pathways. We have karyolysis or nuclear fading, we have pyknosis or nuclear shrinkage, and we have Karyorrhexis or nuclear fragmentation. So karyolysis, it literally means karyon plus lysis. Karyon means nucleus and lysis means dissolution. It refers to the fact that the basophilia of the chromatin fades away. This happens due to the loss of DNA, which is itself due to the activity of endonucleases. Pyknosis or nuclear shrinkage, it literally comes from Greek pikono, meaning to thicken up or to condense. So basically the chromatin condenses into a solid mass, so we have nuclear shrinkage and we have increased basophilia because instead of fading away, it actually condenses. Lastly, we have Karyorrhexis or nuclear fragmentation. So it literally means karyon, meaning nucleus, and rhexis, meaning bursting. So in this case, the already pyknotic nucleus, which is this mass of chromatin, it eventually bursts and undergoes fragmentation, bursts into fragments. The end result of all these three pathways is nuclear dissolution, which leads to anuclear necrotic cells. Let's talk about patterns of tissue necrosis. We can point out two major patterns of tissue necrosis. Firstly, coagulative necrosis and liquefactive necrosis. Firstly, talking about coagulative necrosis. In this one, the architecture of the dead cells are preserved for at least a few days. So the cells are dead, they're enucleated, their internal organelles are damaged, so it looks all eosinophilic due to all the denatured proteins that are in there, but yet it persists in its place and preserves its architecture for a few more days. This is presumably due to the fact that the denatured enzymes aren't just able to break down these structural proteins and digest them. So eventually the leukocytes come and phagocytose all these necrotic cells. So eventually the architecture does go away. So when does coagulative necrosis happen? Coagulative necrosis usually happens due to ischemia. So when we have an obstruction of a vessel, this usually ends up in hypoxia and eventually coagulative necrosis. This is true everywhere except for the brain. So the only place in which ischemia doesn't result in coagulative necrosis is the central nervous system. This is just an exception to know. A definition to know is that a localized area of coagulative necrosis would be referred to as an infarct. Okay, so let's move on to the second major pattern of necrosis, or liquefactive necrosis. This one is characterized by digestion of the dead cells and therefore the destruction of the tissue architecture and transformation of the tissue into a liquid viscous mass. So what triggers liquefactive necrosis? It's usually, you can guess, it has to be like a situation in which we have a lot of enzymatic activity that digests the tissue and transforms it into liquid. So you can guess that it's usually in the bacterial infection or fungal infection, and then it is followed by the accumulation of all the leukocytes that come there, and they too liberate more enzymes and eventually creating this creamy yellow mass of necrotic material that is also called pus. Now, one thing that we already mentioned, but it's kind of important, so I mention it again, is that hypoxic death of central nervous system cells usually manifests liquefactive necrosis as opposed to coagulative necrosis, which is what happens in every other tissue. Okay, so in pathology and medicine, we can actually point out 4 more patterns of tissue necrosis. These aren't specifically death patterns. Sometimes they are just a specific terminology used in certain situations, but we have to know them because these are also necroses practically. Firstly, gangrenous necrosis, caseous necrosis, fat necrosis, and fibrinoid. Okay, so starting with gangrenous necrosis. This one is not exactly a specific death pattern, but usually this term, gangrenous necrosis, is used when a limb loses its blood supply and therefore undergoes coagulative necrosis. But it is in fact also used when a limb undergoes liquefactive necrosis due to extensive bacterial infection. So in this case, the action of degradative enzymes of bacterial infection causes a liquefactive necrosis, which is also called a wet gangrene. Okay, moving on to the caseous necrosis. This one is seen in the foci of tuberculous infection, for example, in the lung tissue. It literally means cheese-like, which refers to its friable white appearance. Microscopically speaking, it looks like a structureless mass of fragmented or lysed cells, and it also has like amorphous granular debris be enclosed within a distinctive inflammatory border. Okay, moving on to the fat necrosis. This term refers to the focal areas of fat destruction, which is usually as a result of leakage of lipases from acinar cells of the pancreas into the peritoneal cavity. This happens in acute pancreatitis. So the lipases liquefy the fat cells, converting the triglycerides into fatty acids. The fatty acids react with the calcium and they create these grossly visible white areas of saponification that actually can help the pathologists and the surgeon to identify better the situation. Okay, lastly, we have fibrinoid necrosis. This one is a special form of necrosis which involves an immune reaction in the blood vessels. So when we have our immune complexes of antigens and antibodies that deposit in the walls of arteries, these deposits combine with fibrin, creating what is called fibrinoids, which literally means fibrin-like. So these fibrinoids have a bright pink look when we stain them with methoxylin and auzin. Thank you very much for watching this video. Don't forget to give us a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. If you want, you can also find us on Facebook and Instagram. Don't forget to take a look at signups.org.